We're going to change a little bit direction because we're going to look through the cultural lens, which is a people group lens. And we're going to go back to basics this morning on people groups, because that comes out of my interactions with a number of you asking different questions about groups of people and people groups and how should we categorize them. And I want to introduce you to two men. You know these men. The first one is Donald McGavin. And he really laid the foundation on which many of today's people group lists are based. And McGavin, he coined a phrase which you know is called the homogeneous unit principle, which put simply is a section of society in which all members have some characteristics in common. So it's a group of people with ethnic, with linguistic, with social, and educational similarities. And the theory is that people feel more comfortable when they feel they are part of a group and don't have to cross barriers of culture or other class barriers in order to worship. So hold that point. The second person I want to introduce you to is Ralph Winter. He was someone who was very instrumental as well and grappled a lot with people group lists. And he helped the church really grasp the true meaning of the Greek word ethne, nations, in Matthew 28:19. And in 1974, he presented a paper to the Lausanne Conference, a paper entitled The Highest Priority of Cross-Cultural Evangelism. And this presentation helped the global church rethink its mission strategy. He helped them go from a focus on political boundaries to people groups, thousands and thousands of people groups. So he helped them look through the world through a different lens. And so people could see that there were still thousands and thousands of people groups who had not yet had an opportunity to respond to the gospel. And over the years since McGavin and Winter, missionary organizations and other organizations have sought to develop and categorize the peoples of the world. So today, there are primarily 3 databases that we use. And they attempt to classify the world's people as the Joshua Project, the IMB database, and the World Christian database. And this is what we use in work along with other missionary organizations to classify our data. But the one question they are trying to answer is this one. What is it that binds people together? That's a key question for us this morning. What is it that binds people together? Now, these are not the only lists. There's Finishing the Task, there's HIS Registry, there's Ethnopedia, there's Call to All. There's a number of subsets as well. So some of you have asked and raised this question about, is people group thinking still relevant today? There are opponents of people group thinking. And so you may be aware of a push by some organizations, some bigger organizations, to move away from a people group focus. Now, this largely comes from the West. It comes from North America. It comes from Europeans. It comes from white South Africans. It comes from Antipodeans. And I think it's worth looking at some of their arguments. So I want to look at that very briefly this morning. You see, there are those who say people group thinking is old and mission agencies have focused too much on it. It is time to move on to something new because it has resulted in boredom among churches and they are looking for something new. So, is this kind of thinking outdated? You see, it's no different to Ralph Winter's argument, is it? When he encouraged us to move on from being country-focused to people group-focused. I think you would agree with me the term unreached has lost some of its original meaning. People talk about their neighbors being unreached. They talk about their family members being unreached. And so it no longer carries the meaning of of those with virtually no access to the gospel. So is it time to move on? Do we need a new term? Is there still value in WEC using the people group thinking as one of our tools when it comes to reaching the unreached and setting strategy? So hold that thought as we move forward. Well, as well as those who say people group thinking is old and it's time to move on, there are those who question the biblical basis of it. Josh Baylor with the IMB. He lives here in Germany, in Dusseldorf. And he argues for a more biblical way to reach the peoples of the world. And he wants us to view two key texts side by side. The first one is Matthew 24:14, you know that. And then there's Matthew 24:36. So if we take the first one, then we can act as if the mission of God and the return of Christ is dependent on us. If we take it out of context and by itself, and we forget just a few verses later that Jesus says that the day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So we do need to be careful with this kind of thinking, because as he rightly points out, if we say every people group must be simultaneously reached by our current definitions, then we have made Christ's return a moving target that keeps him at a safe distance in the future. And there are those like Josh Baylor who remind us that the command in Matthew 28 is not only to pursue the unreached, but all nations everywhere. And our goal should be all peoples and all geographical areas, to all parts of the earth, as expressed in Acts 1:8. So hold that. Now, a question that is often debated and talked about in mission circles is how much investment should be made to bring the gospel to places where the gospel has already been proclaimed? It's a good question, isn't it? It's one we wrestle with. And many of you will know this quote from Oswald J. Smith. He says, "No one has the right to hear the gospel twice, while there remains someone who has not heard it once." That quote has been inspirational to many, to myself, to go to unreached peoples and to different nations, to those who have never heard the gospel. It has encouraged many to go and to reflect on the importance of taking the gospel to those who have never heard. The Apostle Paul's ambition, after all, wasn't it not, to preach the good news to those who had never heard, Romans 15:20. Now I question, and you might question, whether the phrase, "no one has the right to hear the gospel twice," is biblical. You see, Paul went to new places, but he also built up the churches which he had previously planted. So I think we would do well to listen to the warnings that others have raised, and we need to get our missiology right. We are called to reach the unreached, but Christ calls us to make disciples. And I believe we have a healthy balance in WEC, where we see people group focus as one tool to help us discern what God is saying to us, where God is leading us. We have a research framework which allows us to see and to evaluate need as well as leaving room for the Holy Spirit's leading and guidance. That's why we have today Jason, Molly, and Ronaldo. We're looking at the state of the world through different lenses. No one is right, but we're looking at it at different angles. What is the Lord saying as we look through these different realities, these different lenses to us? So that leads me on to the question, who are the unreached? The ethno-linguistic people group listings have been a big help to us as a mission agency. However, with rapid urbanization, as we heard just now, taking place, we recognize there is a need to look beyond these lists so that we can address the question of what is it that binds people together in an urban setting? Is it class? Is it careers? Is it some other social grouping? For some cities, as Jason said, the boundaries are very clear. For others, They are not. People assimilate. They acclimatize. And so the boundaries become very blurred. Well, 2 years ago, the International Council wrestled with this question: who are the unreached? And with discussion with others, myself, Ronaldo, many others, we came up with a definition for WEC. And I want us to read this together so we're clear together who the unreached are. So let's read this together. Unreached people group. An identifiable people group in which there is no indigenous community of believers with adequate numbers, resources, or commitment to evangelize itself. While WEC's primary focus is reaching ethno-linguistically defined unreached people groups, groups of people with a common affinity who have no access to the gospel unless someone crosses barriers may also be considered as unreached. I hope that's clear. That means possible groupings of people with a common affinity could be people with disabilities. It could be vulnerable women. It could be street children. It could be the poor, the marginalized. So I want you to hold that thought as well. So the question is, why should WEC keep a people group focus? Well, an answer, I believe, because it helps us make sense of the overwhelming challenge. And I believe there are biblical principles for it, which comes from the heart of God. And we see that right from the Abrahamic covenant right through to the book of Revelation. Now note, I am saying there are biblical principles for it. I'm not saying it's totally biblical. I'm saying there are biblical principles within this tool we are using. People group thinking is one model that allows us to look at the potential barriers to the gospel spreading. And that is a key concept for us. Because until we identify the barriers, we will struggle to know how to engage people in the right way. It permits us to see who has access to the gospel and who doesn't have access to the gospel. It's a starting point, and it's a starting point in our strategy to see a group engaged and disciples made. Globalization, urbanization, migration are great challenges to the people group focus. But I strongly believe that the people group model is one that can and will continue to serve us for the foreseeable future. We need to know how we're doing. You know, when I'm tasked by someone by the ILT to do something, there's an expectation, an expectancy that I will do it. There is accountability. There is measurement. And today, we know there are people who have not yet heard the gospel. Therefore, I can say, or we can say, we have not seen the fulfillment of our objective or our vision. So people group thinking is not an absolute science. It's just one tool and one approach that helps us. People group thinking helps us identify the barriers to the gospel spreading. And there will always be exceptions to the model. No model is perfect. A model is just that. It breaks down somewhere. You know, if we advocate or support the idea or argue for the for the demise of unreached people group thinking, like some are doing, then I say we might be at risk of losing any sense of prioritization. So what strategy? What should our current strategy be? A lot of current strategy looks at reaching the big unreached people groups over 100,000 in population. And the idea is that they can then reach out to the smaller groups once reached. Now, if we are thinking in terms of reaching these remaining unreached peoples, we need to accept the very real challenges of remote locations, poor healthcare, poor educational opportunities for our children. There will be visa challenges, there will be political challenges, there will be violence, there will be instability, there will be war. And we will have to look for creative ways, more creative ways of overcoming those challenges. This is going to require further research. It's going to require further planning, long-term commitment, and a willingness for us to experiment, and having an arena to fail. The idea, we need to fail. We don't need to fail, but we will fail. But get back up, try again. Fail, experiment, learn, try again. And finally, find a solution that will help us sustain our efforts for the long term of reaching the unreached. We need to be willing to commit for the long haul. The remaining unreached, as you will see in a minute, will stretch us in every way, will cost us, and there will be setbacks, and there will be losses. Now, when thinking about reaching the unreached, I think we need to keep in mind that there are large segments of barely engaged people groups. So the unengaged need to be reached, but the underengaged need strengthening. Many of our teams are just made up of one or two engaging different people groups. They need strengthening. So our approach should be to look at the unengaged as well as support the under-engaged teams in existence. Both strategies are necessary. So let me show you this picture. This is the overall picture of unreached people groups. You can see the mass of red dots. This is from the Joshua Project. Now, the statistics are from the Center for Study of Global Christianity. You will see in this table, today there are 7,040 unreached groups. So how do we choose which areas of the world we should focus on? 7,040 unreached people groups. How do we decide which cities, which locations to move into? And you might be thinking people group theory or the model won't help us. But you would be wrong. Because we can filter the database for the 50 largest unreached people groups. And that's what I've done now. I'm going to present that to you. And if we do that, just filtering the database for the 50 largest unreached people groups, then it yields 3 areas that I think WEC needs to consider and to think about, to take note of. What is the Lord saying to us about the 3 areas I'm about to show you? And these are the 3 areas of North Africa. They are the Indian subcontinent and the Arabian Peninsula. And filtering the data in this way, you get a sense of the millions who have yet to hear or have access to the gospel. And by doing a little bit more research on the ground, you can very quickly start to make some strategic decisions. 3 areas. First one, North Africa. The 3 countries I put here are the unreached, unengaged people groups of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Now, in this count, I've not put Mauritania because that's classified in the Joshua Project setting as under West and Central Africa. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So where does it start? It starts with prayer. Let's pray for change. It can happen. Morocco. Morocco has a population of 35 million. Half of that population are made up of Arab Moroccans, 18.5 million of them, considered unreached. What about Algeria? Notice I put a ranking. It's ranked number 42 on the World Watch List. What is that? This is the Open Doors ranking of persecution. The most difficult countries and places to live as a Christian. It means being a follower in some of these places, you will face beatings, you will face imprisonment, you will likely face discrimination and abuse, and it could cost you your life. What about Tunisia? Tunisia is the smallest country in North Africa with a population of 11.5 million. 10.5 million of those are Arab Tunisian. Who will reach them? Listen to this article I came across just before coming here. It says, being a Christian here is hard, says JL, a Tunisian who asked not to share his full name for safety reasons. When asked about what makes it hard to be a Christian in Tunisia, he said, "It's as if you are in the valley of the shadow of death. You don't know whom to trust. You can lose your job at any time if your religion is discovered. You walk in the street imagining that everyone next to you is holding a knife to your throat. You don't know who is going to stab you first." When asked about the situation for other Christians from different denominations, he said Catholics are in heaven compared to Protestants, especially converts. They literally lose all for Christ. It's North Africa. Looked at Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. What about the Indian subcontinent? And here I'm talking about India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. And perhaps you're saying, why India? Why should India be on this list? Because there's a lot of work going on in India. However, the vast majority of the work is mostly in the far northeastern and southernmost states. If you look through the people group lens, it's just a mass of red dots. There are still big segments of society unreached. 21 of the 50 largest unreached people groups in the world are in India. Another way of looking at the data is saying 2,276 unreached peoples out of a total of 7,040 unreached peoples are in India. In other words, 32% of the world's unreached peoples live in India. And you can play with data. Further filtering the data yields 95% of the population live in an unreached people group. And depending on how you classify the poor, some data sets say 1/3 to 40% of the world's poor live in India. One thing is for sure. If we want to reach this subcontinent, our workers will need to live simple lifestyles, and in many cases, accept poor health conditions. The current political climate makes visas an issue for many foreigners. Now, if you look at that list of the largest 21 unreached people groups in India, you'll see right at the top is the Sheikh, 85 million. 85 million of them. Partnerships with the local church are essential to reach Indians. I want to bring Bangladesh, one of the biggest Muslim countries in the world. Just like India, the largest unreached people group are the Sheikh. The challenge is enormous, and it's going to take much prayer to see this people group reached. The Sheikh have been in spiritual darkness for centuries, so it's going to take a lot of prayer. And things can change, just like they did in China, through prayer. Let me bring Pakistan into the picture. The Sheikh in Bangladesh. But look at the data sets for Pakistan. You'll see the Jat are the largest unreached people group in Pakistan. But look, these 4 are on the top 50 list as well that you're seeing on the screen. But look where the Sheikh, 12.7 million also in Pakistan. These are not easy countries to live. You'll see it is ranked number 5 on the rating of persecution. Not an easy place to stay. Let me just go on, talk about the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula covers the countries of Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen. Now just look at this interesting statistic. It comes from the United Nations population growth for the fastest growing countries in the last 20 years. Look where they're all located. The vast majority in the Arabian Peninsula. One country is not Islamic on that list if you can identify it. However, we don't have time to look at the list just now, but I want to hone in or highlight just 2 people groups in this area. Both of them, again, on the largest of the 50 unreached people groups of the world. And the first one is in Saudi Arabia. And I want to focus in on the Saudi Najdi. It's on that top 50 list. Najdi is one of the varieties of Arabic language spoken by Saudis. And the last country I want to bring to your attention is Yemen. Yemen holds a special place for many of us on our hearts. But I put it on the list, it's part of the 50. What is the Lord saying to us about Yemen? Yemen is very hard to enter just now, nigh on impossible. We have not forgotten Yemen. Let's continue to pray. So in concluding, I think people group thinking is one model that does allow us to look at the potential barriers to the gospel spreading. It's a key concept for us because until we identify the barriers, we will struggle to know how to engage people in the right way. The need before us looks enormous, always does. And as we look through the lens of the people groups and the cultural lens, the challenges posed to reaching the remaining unreached will take all that we have. It will be costly. And we need to acknowledge the barriers, the potential barriers to the gospel. We also believe God is calling us to trust Him and to pray for those open doors. So what is God saying to us about these three major blocks that I put before you? North Africa. What is He saying about the Indian subcontinent and the Arabian Peninsula? Perhaps we could enter into a season of prayer for these three blocks for 1 year. Let's see what the Lord does as we pray into these people groups. Thank you.